Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, could Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott learn to share power? Rob Oakeshot's cheeky idea to change government. What Bob Katter really thinks about the Coalition's record in the bush, and have the Greens' gains been overhyped? Our panel tonight, Imre Salusinszky, journalist with The Australian, Jessica Brown from the Centre for Independent Studies, and John Barron from ABC News Radio. Well, 3 days on from the election and we still don't have a clear result, but there have been some movements in the last hour in some doubtful seats. Let's talk to the ABC's election analyst Anthony Green, who has some news on which way the critical seat of Denison is likely to go. Anthony, what's the latest?
Well, the Electoral Commission, starting yesterday, began to recount every booth from Saturday night and to do the preference flow between Labor and Andrew Wilkie. Now, I've had a lot of emails about Andrew Wilkie finishing third, so how can he end up being in the distribution of preferences? Well, he gets Green preferences, which gets him ahead of the Liberal, and then the Liberal preferences go to Wilkie in the majority. Well, they've done a complete recount of all the booths they'd already counted, and Wilkie is 1,375 votes ahead. That's 51.2%. Now, I've done some calculations. The current count is 81%. You get maximum of about 95% counted in an electorate because you always get a few people who don't vote. Labor has got to get 57% of the postal and absent vote from here, and that's not a percentage they're going to get. So I think we can call Andrew Wilkie as the victor in Denison, and that's a seat that Labor's been unable to win now.
OK, let's talk about the seat of Hasluck in WA. The count's changed a little bit there today as well, and that's a critical seat for who forms government.
Well, they've started to count some postal votes today. There were some pre-polls earlier, not pre-polls, absent votes earlier, and they tended to favour Labor slightly. But the postals have been much more strongly for the Liberal Party, as have some of the pre-poll votes. And at this stage, the lead has widened from about 380 at this time yesterday to 539. So that's looking a little more solid for the Liberal Party, but there's still a fair few votes to go. It's not a seat you could call yet, but so far, that's good news for the Liberal Party. So,
Annie, just to clarify, if the Liberal Party holds Hasluck and Andrew Wilkie wins Denison, that means the Coalition will have 73, Labor 72, and those betting markets might turn around again.
Yes, well, the betting markets do have a habit of following the facts rather than the facts, following the betting markets. One other thing we've seen, Brisbane has narrowed today. I'm not sure why, but Brisbane had done no declaration vote counting at the end of yesterday, and there was very little through most of the day. There finally started to be a few absent votes come in today. The lead narrowed from a bit over 800 to about 657. There's a lot more voting to go. There's only about a bit over 72% counted in Brisbane. So that's the one which is not as progressed as others. That's the only other seat which could switch a different way at this stage. Corangamite has narrowed with the postal votes, but the absent vote is more likely to favour Labor in Corangamite, so I think Corangamite is not going to go back to the Coalition.
And Boothby and Dunkley last night were in doubt. That's changed again?
Both of those have widened for the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party will hold Boothby. You'd expect the postal votes to favour the Liberal Party, and that's exactly what they've done. They have the sitting member, and the same in Dunkley. The sitting member's personal vote has improved with the counting of the postal votes.
Anthony Green, thanks a lot for the update.
Thank you.
So that's really interesting news, Imre. Looks like Coalition 73, Labor 72. That's going to make it much harder for Julia Gillard to be Prime Minister.
Absolutely. I was just thinking then perhaps Anthony Green could form a unity government. He actually understands what's going on. Look, if one party holds more lower house seats than the other, I think that party of necessity will form or attempt to form a minority government. I work in a parliament, I've just come from a parliament, and it's simply unsustainable for a government party to have fewer seats than the party opposite, because every question time is a world of pain then for the leader of the government, who faces louder voices ahead of them than there are behind them. If it's 73 all, then we get into very tricky territory. But I would say, Steve, that all of those three rural independents come from heavily conservative areas. In Tony Windsor's seat of New England, twice as many people supported the Coalition than Labor in the Senate. So the point that I'd make very strongly is they're going to have a lot of trouble finessing with their own constituents support for a minority Labor government.
Jessica, is that the way you see it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what will be weighing quite heavily on the independents' minds is this number of seats issue. We've had a lot of talk, Tony Abbott saying that the Coalition has a greater primary vote. Julia Gillard saying Labor have a greater two-party preferred vote. What really matters is the seats. And I think that will weigh quite heavily on the independents' minds when they're making a decision about which way they're going to go.
What about the Green, John? Does that become a factor as well? Because
Well,
the Greens said they're going to side with Labor. Should Labor count that as one of their own?
Well, the Green and the former Green in Andrew Wilkie, former Green, former Liberal, former Independent, former just about everything. And of course, in all of this, I mean, Bob Katter is very much the wild card. He points out that while people see the seat of Kennedy in far north Queensland as being a solidly Conservative seat, if it hasn't been held by Bob Katter or Bob Katter's father, it's been held by the Labor Party.
Yeah, and I think four of the state seats in his electorate are
right.
Labor.
So there is an argument that says that in fact this is Labor heartland rather than Conservative heartland, which is the other argument that we're hearing at the moment as well. Bob Katter points out, look, his two political heroes are Red Ted Theodore and Jack McEwen, the
so
founder
one's
of the
a former
Country
Labor
Party.
treasurer and one's a former Country Party
So
leader.
Bob Katter, he's hard to figure, and what he might do in all of this is anybody's guess.
Well, whatever's the case is that someone's got to sort out national banana policy, don't they?
It's going to be crucial.
Well, the three independents who could hold the balance of power in the next parliament have met behind closed doors in Canberra this afternoon. Before they went into that meeting, Rob Oakeshott flagged a left-field idea about how a minority government could be formed.
They are friends. There is plenty of bipartisan work that's done by the Parliament. Yes, it's an adversarial place, but people are over the one says black, the other says white.
So
let's try and work together on some potential power sharing arrangements. There's a whole range of options in other jurisdictions, and let's at least explore that for a week. And if we can't get there, then we'll fall back to minority, red team, blue team, plus.
But Tony Abbott was less than enthusiastic about that idea.
I'm a very magnanimous man, but that might be going a little too far.
Jess, there have been a National Party minister in a Labor government in South Australia, but this is unlikely to work federally, this idea, isn't it?
Yeah, look, and not only is it naive, I actually think the idea is a little bit dangerous. I mean, we have a two-party system for a reason. No one wants to live in a one-party state, and opposition is there to oppose. It provides a check and balance on the government of the day, and even though we can get a bit frustrated when we see the Parliament not working as well as we want it to, having a system where everyone's in the tent and no one's allowed to disagree could potentially be very undemocratic.
Yeah, it's a strange suggestion really from Rob Oakeshott, who was looking like Jimmy Stewart yesterday and is now looking as though maybe his electorate takes in more of Nimbin on the far coast of New South Wales than we expected. I mean, you look at the examples in recent history. Zimbabwe went for a government of national unity after there were dozens of deaths in election-related violence. The British went for a government of national unity when doodlebugs were being sent over from Germany. I don't think either of those things apply to this election, as confusing as it is. A unity government, I don't think is going to happen.
And Imre, Chris Uhlmann made the point today, we didn't even have a unity government during World War II.
Exactly.
How are we going to have one in peacetime?
What's the bigger crisis today? Whilst I agree with the other panellists on that, it's nevertheless easily possible to see a Tony Windsor or a Rob Oakeshott sitting as a cabinet minister in a coalition government. You mentioned the South Australian example. To think of one of those two in an Abbott government is less of a stretch than what we have happening in South Australia. And yet, on the same logic as I used before, I think it is a bit of a stretch to see one of those sitting as a cabinet minister in a Gillard government.
Well, Tony Abbott said any Labor government effectively would be an alliance with the Greens, and that would be very bad for regional Australia. He said that today during a press conference, and here's what Bob Katter had to say about this afternoon.
Tony's mob were in there for 12 years. At the end of the 12 years, there was a farmer committing suicide every 4 days in this country. If they were good for the bush, I'm a Martian astronaut.
John Barron, what do you make of that comment from Bob Katter?
I rest my case on Bob Katter. Bob Katter he's a fascinating character. People in his electorate up Townsville Way, they love him, they loved his dad, they think the Katters are terrific, he speaks their language, and he is very much a conscience politician. And isn't it interesting that the electorate seems to be responding in significant numbers to people who are genuine, even if they appear at times to be genuinely nuts, which is the case with Bob. But he is a serious man, he's a serious man with serious concerns, and he's more in touch with a lot of the people that vote for him than a lot of our representatives are.
That is true, and even though he does cover such a big electorate. Jess, do you think that argument's going to resonate, the one that Tony Abbott was making today with the country independents, that a Labor-Green alliance is not going to do the bush any favours?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, as you can see from what Katter said, he feels like he's been pretty hardly done by under the Howard government, and the issue is none of these three independents feel very a lot of very kind thoughts about the National Party. And they would be just as likely.
But that would make them any different to the Liberals.
That's true. You know, I think we've seen this convergence of the two parties. For these guys, I mean, there doesn't seem to be a huge philosophical gulf between Labor and Liberal at the moment. I don't think it'd be much of a jump for them to go. And especially someone like Katter, who's made it pretty clear he's going to use his position of power to, you know, try and get what he can for his electorate.
Well, much of the electorate has been underwhelmed by what the major parties have been offering at this election. And last night on Q&A, former Labor Senator Graham Richardson ripped into both parties for their inability to argue their beliefs.
They've got to convince Australia it's right. And no one did that. And unless you do that, that's what politics is about. I said it earlier on. You've got to persuade. I think Labor stopped persuading on it, needs to get back to it.
Imre, is Richo right?
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, surely this is part of what we've seen over the last 10 years where the party's messages are driven by what focus groups tell them rather than the other way around. I think they've grown unused to establishing a position because it syncs with their core values and then prosecuting that case. And I think Cheryl Kernot said rather interestingly when she launched her ill-fated Senate bid that she had a kind of nostalgia for the days when she was in the federal parliament, and you had a Paul Keating and a John Howard who were not, you know, focus group driven, but had values and views that they were willing to prosecute. And she rather grudgingly said that she would include Howard along with Keating in that description, even though she was obviously politically closer to Keating. Look, there's been a lot of bagging of Mark Latham during this campaign. And I think we should be careful before we make impersonating a journalist a crime, or we could all be in trouble. But I seem to remember that when Mark Latham was leader of the Labor Party, for about 10 minutes I think I knew what Labor stood for, and I quite liked it. And for all of Mark's unsuitability for the Prime Ministership at a personality level, I think he was the last perhaps serious attempt to just establish a core set of beliefs, values and policies and then sell those to the Australian people, and it's been pretty much all drift since.
John, Richo was part of a government which was Hawke and Keating, both people with strong beliefs, both people who I guess have been in the Labor movement from a young age and had to argue their case at all those conferences and party room meetings.
An exchange of ideas. It's a quaint and slightly charming idea. It's a bit like suggesting that we should have our politicians in Speaker's Corner on a soapbox once again. It's not going to happen, partly because, particularly in elections